This is Branko Malic of Kali Tribune with a podcast that will be in part an answer to a reader's question. Now, as everybody following Kali Tribune knows, I tend to answer all questions. Sometimes we have a rather lengthy discussions on the website. Sometimes more on YouTube channel we have exchange of insults, which can be fun in itself also. And this question I received just yesterday, kind of pointed into direction that I am already working on, but it is a kind of question that is a cluster of question by the reader going by the pseudonym Kbone91. So hi Kbone, you'll have at least some of your answers now. Questions are too complex to answer in a comment form, and I deemed it very good to use them as a basis for a short podcast and to point out the development of some ideas I'm working on. And of course, I will not answer each and every question to a reader's satisfaction. I know that, because those questions are too difficult to be answered in full. My work is a kind of taken as a whole is an attempt to answer precisely this kind of questions. So I'll read some of these, a part of this comment, some passages, and try to answer the questions contained therein. So here goes the questions. Hi Branko, in terms of free will, how is it that people can make independent decisions in a climate where propaganda is so pervasive? Doesn't free will imply some kind of ability to independently reason above and beyond the state, party, corporate context in which people find themselves? Well, I think I can relatively straightforwardly answer to this. And the first thing is that this question in fact points out one very, I would say, essential aspect of propaganda or infowar or psyops, or call it whatever you like. Propaganda is a rather crude term. I don't think it is really applicable anymore as it was in the times of communism and the Cold War. Namely, there is a very very important and substantial role played by free will in propaganda, but not in the sense that free will is something that should serve as a safe harbor for intellect to resist propaganda. More to the contrary, free will is essential in accepting propaganda. That is, free will, just to build upon this, is essential to ask to be propagandized. Now, what I mean by this, I'll give you an example that will be probably unpopular. As I'm making this podcast, we have a brouhaha about mass shooting that happened in Las Vegas, USA. The very fact that I, from Croatia, from a little town in Croatia, should depict what happened in Las Vegas would be foolish. But whole plethora of people are posting on internet, from social networks to semi-serious to non-serious websites, with supposed explanations in the sense of false flag, attack didn't happen, attack was George Soros misdeed. I don't really, I'm not really following what they are saying because I don't really care, but how they pin this to Soros, even this, is really beyond my capacities of my imagination. What we have at work here is not information gathering or trying to make sense of media mediated reality. We are seeing the instance of wishful thinking, of wishing the event to be something. Now let us suppose, for an instance, for the sake of argument, that alt media are some monolithic media front used by some great power to manipulate people. How, which it is not, in my opinion. I know there were instances when I pointed out the Russian influence in alt media, which is huge, but alt media are not Russian creation. I really think that alt media spontaneously grow out from the use of internet and from losing faith in mainstream, not only media, but academia and political class also. If somebody wanted to manipulate people, he would have to wait for them to ask him. This is what I mean to say. In this instance, one who would like to manipulate alt media following crowd would have to use the idea that the shooting in Las Vegas was not what was said that it is in mainstream media. Okay. This would be an act of really good and really, I think, successful propaganda. And this is how free will can be, and indeed it has to be, a building block of propaganda. Now, when we talk about free will, the question was, how can people make independent decisions in the climate where propaganda is so pervasive? Well, do we really make independent decisions based on information? I'm really not so sure, because there is a very, very important distinction to make between, for instance, information and sense perception and imagination. Information is one step above all that. Information is a quantified unit of knowledge. This is something that is, in my opinion, in fact, self-contradictory. This is the knowledge that, at least biological determinants of what knowledge is, from my viewpoint, it is not knowledge at all. It is the illusion of knowledge. Because information is something that came to pass with an advent of systems theory and then the advent of cybernetics and computer science. Before that, I'm not so sure that images and let's say mediated experiences that people acquired via, for instance, press into the 20th and parts of 19th and 18th century, but also in Middle Ages, the story of travelers, the reports, the writings of the few historians that worked at that time, and so on. I don't really think that they were mediating information. They were mediating opinion and so on, their ideas, their insights. And mind you, I would say, for instance, for sources of antiquity, that a good deal of them proved to be very accurate. Even poets that were always being accused by philosophers as great liars, poets as Homer, because as far as I know, archaeologists still take the fact that Troy was found on Hislaric by Heinrich Schliemann, who was following exactly Homer's waypoints and indication is really a Troy. And I do say this with some knowledge because I do work in this branch, archaeology, not as archaeologist, but as a worker in archaeology. I know a lot of archaeologists, and I frequently ask them about, for instance, the relevance of Heinrich Schliemann and such things, and he is as relevant as he was. To their opinion, I'm talking about Croatian archaeologists. So information is other thing. Information, in my opinion, always points to a system. It is not something that can be isolated, but always points out to the whole, what we would say, big picture. But this big picture is something that is not built on knowledge. It is built on imagination, that is, on attempt to turn the knowledge into material given that can be quantified and manipulated, and then collected in a meaningful structure resembling a huge puzzle. And what is important in this puzzle is that its meaning is changeable. Its meaning is subjective. And we can see the instance of this in that word narrative that is very prevalent, especially in Americans. The word that was taken from Jacques Derrida in perhaps one other context, and I will have something to write and say about this in the future, but which points to this ability to construct the story, to construct the information configuration, systemic, that is based on some amount of willpower, on my ability to impose my own will to reality, to push my narrative. And all media now are talking in narratives, explicitly so. Alt media, mainstream media, this media, such media. What has this, how this can in a way stop free will from being free? I think it doesn't. I don't think that our choices are really informed choices. Our choices, if they are good, are rational and moral choices. And rationality and morality is something that is far more fundamental than information, and in a way, in my opinion, and I will try to prove this in my further work on Kali Tribune, they are something opposite of information, in fact. Something quite the opposite. So, let's take, for example, as my reader says, in clarifying his question, in America, unquote, Keybone. In America, it is rare for most of the public to exercise free will or independent decision-making beyond their familiar cultural context. Well, end quote. America is not unique in this. What makes America unique, as far as I can tell, is precisely this digitalization of knowledge, this attempt to petrify knowledge into information, but ideological manipulation to an extent that we could call it brainwashing was something I grew up in. I grew up in communism. It was not behind the Iron Curtain. It was very, very different than what you had, for instance, in, God forbid, Albania, or even Romania, or to go further, in the Soviet Union. But it was completely, it was indoctrination into myths of revolution of Yugoslav peoples, into cartoonish view of history, cartoonish view of economy, cartoonish view of that proud country of Yugoslavia that was supposedly blessed with unbelievable mineral resources, which is the crossroads of worlds, which is completely independent because of brotherhood and unity of its people, that 10 years after that started to kill each other. And everything fell up. The thing is, not everybody, almost nobody took this seriously. Even the people who were selling this, who were projecting this ideology, and inside of ideology they worked for to provide people with real teaching, or for instance, kids with real teachings, or people with real media. For instance, you had a subject in high schools called Marxism, or Theory and Praxis of Self-Management. And self-management was supposedly this unique Yugoslav way of running the economy, which was, of course, total a disaster. But what you got under the Marxism was sociology and philosophy, because professors, high school teachers, who graduated philosophy or sociology or politology, were 90% of them didn't believe in this. They knew that it was stupid, and they were, at least in the 80s, when I was a kid, they were teaching philosophy. For instance, you could learn in sociology. For instance, you could learn about Max Weber. You could learn about Emile Durkheim in high school. From these subjects that were by name, you would think that they are something from today's North Korea, but in substance, people were doing something else. This is what I mean. Free will and intellect are informed in a very different way than by ideology. They are not so much informed from the outside. It is my opinion, and I can substantiate this opinion as a teaching that stretches from ancient Greeks to medieval theologians and philosophers, is that mind, in the act of thinking, mind becomes one with its object. That is, when I say it becomes one, I mean one. There is no discrepancy between subject and object. And what is interesting here, this may sound as some kind of special ability. It is not. It is in the nature of thought, of learning. And this proper object of mind is intelligibility of the world. This is this rational, to use rational in a very strict sense, meaningful, let's use this rather vague term, meaningfulness of things that is apprehended immediately. Not in the sense that it is understood immediately, but it is in us immediately, and then we try to comprehend it and can lose our way. This is something that no propaganda, no amount of psyops can take from you if you don't wish it to be taken from you. That is, if you don't decide for the truth to be what you want to be. And when you consider the truth as something that is amenable to your will, in that case, the truth goes in the sphere, in my opinion, in the sphere of imagination. Because imagination is something where we, in a way, produce the objects of cognition by ourselves. We're using this sensual experience as a kind of raw stuff or raw material which we work upon. And if we take this example and put it again in the sphere of media and ideology, and especially alt media and these lone nut shooters phenomena, we can see, as if we're watching scientific experiment in behavioral self-engineering, how people who are into alt media are trying to find the truth they want to see. This is how propaganda comes to pass. Propaganda has to be, if it is, in my opinion, if it is to be successful, it has to be something you want. It has to give you something. And if anybody wants to manipulate, for instance, alt media consumer, he would give all this out. He would work on refining and selling the idea that, for instance, George Soros paid somebody to organize this Las Vegas shooting, and that there was whole plethora of anomalies, and there are always anomalies. Some of those shootings, don't get me wrong, are extremely dubious events. I do really think so, but this is now so out of hand that it is, I think, better to ignore these events than try to interpret them in the heuristic spectacles of provided by alt media. People are given, and now to return to the question itself, it is about America. Critical as my questionnaire remarks, quote, critical thinking and factual analysis are simply not skills your average American is schooled in these days. Well, who is? The very idea that school will provide you with these things just out of itself is, I think, very naive. It was never like that. I mean, I'm basing my exposition here on Middle Ages philosophers like Thomas Aquinas, on ancient philosophers like Aristotle, who was for a year at least a teacher of Alexander of Macedon, Alexander the Great. So very small number of people in traditional world was schooled rigorously in those things. But this doesn't mean that those that weren't schooled were stupid, naive, and that they couldn't think. And now maybe we could say that precisely this relying on this education as something that should prepare you for all this is a little bit naive. The intelligence and ability to discern in these things, which are practical things, comes from, I think, two sources. The clearness of thought and the right direction of will, that is, of being principled and not trying to indulge oneself. And this is something everybody can do. I for instance, don't have this anti-American stance, consider Americans as stupid or evil and so on. There are some features of Americans that are very unique, and some are very uniquely bad. But I saw in this Eastern European, say, tenuously Central European country I live in, this whole region, I saw how people work themselves in madness en masse. And for 27 or maybe even 30 years, still don't try to face the truth that they deluded themselves and got themselves being led by the nose into war, for instance. So I don't think that Americans are unique here, and they were not manipulated by communism. They were manipulated with quote unquote return to tradition, return to Middle Ages, even to principles, to historical continuity, to take revenge for historical slides, some of which they completely invented, and so on and so forth. So I don't think it's unique to Americans. It's not unique to education. It is something that is deeply human, and it is, in fact, in my opinion, a thing of good and evil, choice between good and evil. And this choice is not informed choice. This is a discerning choice, a good or bad choice. I don't think information play that significant role there, although I do see the point that living in most postmodern probably of countries like America, you are in a bad situation in the sense that you have no direct contact with tradition in the sense of historical continuity, the barest historical continuity. This I affirm is very, very hard, but as I said, it is hard. It is very wrong to say that somebody living where I live, or God forbid, somebody living in Russia, is so much better off, non-manipulated by media, by ideology, and so forth. In Croatia, for instance, you have these attempts to infuse everybody with this sustainable development idiocy, but it is such an idiocy that it very soon people start to react against it. I understand that in America it's easier to sell something like that, but still the principle remains that propaganda and psy-war or situation where people's minds are molded in a wrong way is something that is much more fundamental than ideology. That you have, and the very fact that it is more fundamental means that it is more dangerous, but very fact that it is more dangerous means that it is more in your hands, that it is not so much essentials, in essential sense, it's not so much rooted in your education, in media, it is rooted more in decisions and in ability to think clearly, not to think clearly from books, although books are tremendous help, education in classics and so on. But essentially this is something in human being, man is infused with this. And it can be exercised or not being exercised. But of course it is far easier not to exercise it, and so most people don't think. But it was always so. It was never that a lot of people were doing a lot of thinking. It was never like that. Because thinking things out, especially this philosophical sense, and it is very burdensome, and it is very unpopular, and it was more or less always unpopular among the masses of humanity, and it is only natural that most of the people won't spend their lives in it. But that this does not mean that they cannot think in appropriate amount for their own choice of life or how they live, and make and discern and will the right thing, because discernment and will are something that are in immediate contact with their objects. Media by themselves, the very qualification of what the media is something mediated. Every media contact is mediated. The good, the true, the beautiful are not mediated. That's something Hegel would say, but I don't agree with Hegel on that. So, to finish with the question, I'll quote the last passage, what K-Bone has to say and ask and conclude. So, quote, I'm not sure how extensive a relevant agency can be when the public mind is so easily molded in a totalitarian system, or even in the American context. By agency, he thinks of good and evil. Or even in the American context. Where does choice begin and manipulation end? What do you think? Blah, blah, blah. Well, I think I answered, I gave this preliminary bird's view answer to this. I know this is very simple answer, and the simple is the most beautiful and the most strong, but you cannot apply it to your life just out of hand, of course, because it doesn't take into account all the myriad of external circumstances, and my interlocutor here in fact points out these circumstances which are grave and difficult, and I agree with him. But I think I did give already an preliminary answer, and here I would recur to my work on synchronicity, especially the second part, which was in fact introduction in this what will, I hope, become the series of studies on Kali Tribune on the nature of the relation of mind to reality along the lines of this principle that between mind and reality there is no difference in one sense, that they are one. Not in the sense that reality is subjective or the mind is objective. This is something that is before that. And I will try to demonstrate, sometimes from the work of people like Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, or we'll see, maybe we'll use some other of great thinkers, that this in fact, this is the fact, and this is something that is far more accessible to common sense, that this is the common sense in a way, than most of people think. Although most of us, although we live by some principles, we think by some principles and do it rightly, we don't reflect on them, we are not aware of them because we don't have time and because we don't need them. The reason, in my opinion, why political correctness is so hard to combat is because it attacks normalcy. And it is very hard to define what the normal is, not because it is not obvious, but precisely because it is obvious. Because we never felt the urge to explain what is normal. And so we have great difficulties to demonstrate it to somebody who asks us, well, if you say that marrying the cactus is not normal, what do you think the normal is? And then you have to explain him. And it's not always easy, even in this ridiculous example, which is not far from far from reality now. While on the other hand, political correctness is built upon the system. They first have the system, which is it is self-consistent logically, but it is completely devoid of reality. So they have the upper hand in theory, but they don't have upper hand in reality. But there have to pass a great amount of time until you figure this out and until you start to turn your own normalcy, the common sense, into a doctrine. Because before there was challenge to it, you didn't have to have doctrine. So this is a little maybe moving from the subject at hand. Okay, K-Bone 91, I hope this answers at least a part of your question. Thank you for your question. You did give me some ideas, and as I always say, follow Kali Tribune and support it, if possible, materially. Branko Malic signing out.